In case you missed it, it's Pride Month, and what better time to talk about how you can make authentic trans characters, NPCs and stories for your TTRPG campaigns. If you're cisgender, you'll probably never truly understand what it's like to be trans, but that doesn't mean that you can't make authentic trans NPCs and stories. You just have to go about it in the right way. Hopefully I can help you a little bit with that in this video. First, I'll talk about transition, because that's pretty much at the core of the trans experience, and then I'll talk about how we can make trans NPCs, stories, and then some miscellaneous bits. So let's get right into it. As I said, transition is key to the trans experience because the vast majority of trans people go through it. Therefore, understanding it is essential when you're making trans characters. An important thing to note is that people aren't trans because they transition, people transition because they are trans. It's an important distinction. It can broadly be divided into two categories: the social transition and the physical transition. Starting with the social transition, this is how a person presents themselves and interacts with the world, and this is the easiest one to implement in any game setting, from the highest fantasy to detective noir. Usually the first step in this process is choosing a new name and pronouns. For example, a trans woman usually chooses a feminine name and she/her pronouns. A trans man chooses a masculine name and he/him pronouns. And non-binary people have their own entire field of science dedicated to figuring out their new name. They generally go with they/them pronouns, but they can be any combination like she, they, and so on. The rule of thumb is that the pronouns and name reflects the person. Keep this in mind because the name part will be important when we talk about creating trans characters. The next step in social transition is changing the way you perform your gender. So again, usually a trans woman goes from performing her gender in a masculine way to a feminine way, and vice versa for trans men, over a varying time span. This means changing the way you speak and interact with the world in a way that aligns with the expectations of your actual gender, and usually also how you dress and present yourself. All of these things are based on behavior, which means that as long as your setting has people in it, they can be social transition. And now, physical transition is more about your body. The usual first step in this process is some kind of voice training to change the sound of your voice, and for trans women also hair removal, which can be done with high-tech stuff such as laser and electrolysis, but also with low-tech stuff such as tweezers. This means that unless your setting hasn't invented tweezers yet, these two first steps are very achievable in pretty much any setting. Then most trans people go for hormone replacement therapy, or HRT for short, which brings sweeping changes throughout the body. Everything from brain chemistry to outward appearance to general physiology and even methylation of your DNA. One example of these effects is that during my first year of HRT, I lost about 20 to 25% of my upper body strength, which means that now everything actually weighs something, and I had to consider what groceries I buy so I can actually bring them back home from the store. Was never a problem before. And after HRT comes surgeries. But even though they are a big part of transitioning for many trans folks, I recommend that you leave this out of your consideration when making trans characters and stories. The reason is that it is a very private matter, and it goes into details that you would probably never consider for cis characters. So all in all, much of social and physical transition can be done in pretty much any setting. So what you really need to consider is how you can create an analog for HRT in your world. And you should have this in your setting if you're trans characters, because the effects of HRT are such an important part of transitioning, and denying this to your fictional trans people would be very cruel. About as cruel as denying it to trans people in the real world. Now, a lot of games, and especially D&D games, are set in pre-modern worlds where you can't just swing by the pharmacy and pick up your estudiol. So what do? My best answer is magic and alchemy. Maybe there's a spell or a potion that can produce the effects of HRT. Honestly, it would be pretty cool to just go out into the woods and then whip up your own HRT from herbs and magic crystals. As an example of the magical solution, all my D&D games are set in the Forgotten Realms, and I decided pretty early on that the temples of Sune, the goddess of beauty, would be places where people can get help to transition through divine assistance. Or to take a solution from an official module, in Tomb of Annihilation, there's a trap that can change the sex of your character. And I can tell you that if word got out, there would be a queue of trans people forming up outside this dungeon. Or maybe if you want a solution that is a little bit less magic and sparks, Maybe you can have alchemists in their gloomy labs produce a compound with similar effects to HRT. And even if your setting is pre-modern, but also no magic, there are historical sources that suggest that some sort of hormone therapy was achieved in ancient China and Scythia. So get creative. Alright, so all of this should give you a surface level idea of what transition is and how you can implement it in your game. So let's now look at how you can create trans NPCs. Creating a trans character is easy. It's no different from creating a cis character, but the challenge is to show the players that the NPC is trans without being on the nose about it. For example, no one ever introduces themselves like this. Hi, I'm straight, pleased to meet you. Hi, I'm trans, pleased to meet you. So if a character can't outright say that they're trans, how are your players gonna know? Obviously, you need to be subtle about this. But then your first thought might be something like, yes, I'll give the NPC some kind of physical trait that will hint that they are trans. Maybe the elf queen will be unusually tall or has a pronounced jawline or a deep voice. The problem with this is that you will be engaging in gender stereotyping. I'm trans, and I often meet cis women who are taller than me or have wider jawlines than me, and, albeit rarely, even sometimes someone who has a deeper voice than me. My point is that physical traits don't belong to a certain gender, which makes them useless to indicate if an NPC is trans or not. Basically, don't transvestigate your characters. Instead, you should use traits that are uniquely trans to indicate if a character is trans. But what are these traits? The first trait is something I talked about in the last section, and it is that pretty much all trans people have chosen their own name. And there's often a little story to go along with it. Here are some examples of how you can show this in-game. Something that often happens is players mispronouncing an NPC's name. And if the NPC is trans, they might say something like, I didn't spend a year picking this name to have a rascal like you mangle it. Or if a situation like that doesn't arise naturally, maybe another NPC could advise the player characters that if they want to get into the good graces with this trans NPC, they should compliment their name. Or if there's a situation where the player characters are rummaging through the NPC's belongings, maybe some kind of investigation is going on, maybe they find some items that has names embroidered on them where there clearly was another name previously, or something like that. Whatever you choose to do, just be mindful of dead naming. So dead naming is when you use a trans person's former name, which is considered extremely problematic without consent. So an NPC willfully engaging in this would be considered a bad person. It varies from person to person, but the rule of thumb is that a trans person is unlikely to answer questions about the dead name, and the same should go for trans NPCs. A second somewhat unique trait is that most trans people have a point in their backstory where they went from being depressed, insulated and sad to confident, happy and hopeful about the future. You can indicate this by having other NPCs talk about how the trans NPC used to be so quiet and now they are the life of the town. And maybe the player characters will inquire about this and learn that this person wasn't able to be themselves in the past, but now they can, and then leave it somewhere at that. Again, like with the dead naming, outing a trans person without their consent is considered problematic, so unless you want to paint another NPC as a bad person, they shouldn't do so. A third unique trait is that pretty much all trans people swap out their entire wardrobe after coming out. There are various ways that you can show this in the game. Maybe when the player characters visit the NPC, the home is full of people who are there to donate or exchange clothes. Or a local tailor could offhandedly mention how they helped this NPC with a few free outfits to get them started. These examples could also be a good way to show that this is a caring community. And there are probably more traits than this, and if you're trans, feel free to leave your suggestions down in the comments below. You can probably tell that these traits are quite subtle and require a bit of planning on the DM's part in order for them to happen. And that is kind of the point. Unless the trans NPC is involved in a specifically trans story, which I will talk about in a moment, the most realistic outcome is that the player characters will never realize that they talk to a trans person, just as it is in real life. And all that being said, what I've told you about creating trans characters is what we could call the safe approach, the cautious way to make trans characters. Because there are some trans people who don't care about transitioning at all, and there are many that are fine with being openly trans. But this is a bit more nuanced, so if you're cis, maybe just stick to the safe approach. Okay, so now that we know how we can indicate that an NPC is trans, let's move on to talk about trans stories. A story needs more than a trans character in order to be a trans story. For example, a story about a trans knight who needs the player characters to help him slay a dragon and then distribute its hoard to the local community that it ravaged is a story with a trans character in it, but it's not a trans story. A trans story needs to be about some aspect of the trans experience, just as a coming-of-age story needs to be about the experience of coming of age and not just have a character in it that incidentally comes of age. So what are these aspects of the trans experience? Well, every trans person lives a trans story, so we can basically just take a part of it and then make a story about it. The usual timeline for a trans person is something like this: figuring yourself out, coming out, transitioning, fighting transphobia, helping other trans people. Of course, you can fight transphobia and help other trans people at any point in your journey, but we usually have a lot more energy to do it after we are a few years into transition. So using this timeline, the first kind of trans story we can tell is about figuring yourself out. Here are some examples of what that could look like. A village has this needlessly gendered coming-of-age ceremony, and the player characters needs to help an NPC get ready for their part in it. But the party quickly realizes that this person isn't a fan of the expected feminine role in the ceremony, so maybe they try out the masculine one, but they don't feel at home there either. And in the end, they realize that they need to straddle the divide and embody aspects of both sides. Or there's this oldest of trans story tropes, where there's a prophecy that says that only a person of this or that gender can do this or that. And then during the quest, the NPC or the player character realizes that they can do what wasn't expected of them. What could that possibly mean? Tell me, what could it mean? The essence of this story type is a character who realizes that their resistance to expectations has a natural explanation, and that they do indeed know themselves best. The next trans story type is the coming out story. Here the party could help a character prepare for their great coming out, either by probing the local community about opinions, or helping them find an outfit that is appropriate for this great moment. Or maybe a captain won't take the party to Snake Island because they are concerned about their kid who has been moody and withdrawn for some time. The party tries to investigate and finds out that the kid is struggling to come out to her parents, and through a very social quest about gaining trust and giving support, they help her, and then the captain is happy and can take the party to Snake Island. Or maybe the party has been invited by one of the merchant princes of Port Nansaro to a happy wedding between what everyone assumes are the daughters of two merchant families. But then one of the soon-to-be wed confesses to the party that while they love the person they are engaged with, they fear that she will not be able to return that love once she learns the truth, that her fiancé is actually a man. Again, it's a social quest about solving a complex situation, and you could give it the fun little twist that the other bride is also a groom, perhaps that way solving their conundrum. The next story type is about transitioning, and how you do this depends on the kinds of transitions available in your setting. Maybe a person needs help to get to the Temple of Sune, risking all the dangers and uncertainty that the road might throw at them to get there. The players would literally be helping them with that journey. Or maybe there are these two very happy kids running around the village, a boy and a girl, who everyone talks about how moody and insulated they used to be. A miraculous mood change. Then the party realizes that the kids met a hag in the woods who offered to swap their souls if they helped with something seemingly innocent. Both being trans, of course they jumped at the chance and are now happily and unknowingly spreading the corrupted seeds for the hag. Now, how will the players react to this? Usually hag business is bad, but undoing it here would cause great harm to the kids. These first three story types are very inwardly facing and personal, and the next two are more outward. In stories about fighting transphobia, it's important to recognize that transphobia is, by its very definition, evil. It's about ruining lives and spreading death and misery, so keep in mind that a transphobic character is morally evil and should be treated as such. Transphobia can wear many guises, but at its heart it is about excluding trans people from public life and making life unbearable to live, based on the belief that trans people don't actually exist. Stories like these can range from grand campaign-spanning quests about toppling transphobic governments to more small community stuff like a local transphobe, gatekeeping access to a local shrine or healing springs or whatnot. These stories are less about the inner workings of a trans character and more about the external pressures that they face. A note about creating transphobic villains is that transphobes are always also racist, misogynistic, ableist, and so on, so you might want to include some of that in their character just to round them off. The last trans story type I have for you is the helping other trans people. This might on the surface just seem like all the other stories. Like, how does helping a trans character travel to a temple of transition differ from helping a trans character help another trans character reach the temple of transition? The answer is a focus on the first trans character. The story isn't about helping someone to the temple, but about helping that first trans character give back to the world. Their motivation for helping is key. Maybe they're doing this to atone for someone they failed to help once when they were too busy saving themselves. Or maybe it's about making the world the kind of place they wish they could have grown up in, and that way maybe healing some of their hurt over all the time lost spent living inauthentically. Other stories could be about more tough and complex aspects of the trans experience, but I think we should leave that for trans people to tell. To wrap the video up, I want to talk a bit about your setting, because it will inevitably affect trans characters and stories in it. Is your setting a reflection of the real world with all its rampant transphobia and lack of basic rights for trans people, or is it something else? It might seem more realistic to make your setting mirror real world attitudes, but transphobia isn't natural, and it doesn't come from nothing. Unless your setting has had its fair share of Christian settler colonialism, there's no reason for its society to be inherently transphobic. Trans and non-binary people are recognized by countless cultures throughout the world, from Two Spirits in America to the Heshra in Asia, to Norse gods changing gender on the fly, or the Gala in ancient Rome. We are mentioned on ancient Sumerian tablets at the dawn of written history. We've always been here. We are and have always been part of the human experience, and our erasure is only a recent historical development, mostly spurred on by fanatic Christian organizations in the US. So again, unless your setting has had its own catastrophic global erasure of culture, there's no reason for having widespread transphobia in it. Happy Pride, everyone!